I never wanted this. I never planned for it. But the moment he looked at me like that, I knew there was no going back. What would you do if you were her? Write in the comments. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be standing in my own doorway, staring into the dark, drunken eyes of my sister's boyfriend while he whispered things he had no right to say, I would have laughed in their face. Me? The quiet one, the responsible one, the one who always stayed out of trouble. But trouble has a way of finding you when you least expect it. And that night, trouble was standing right in front of me. My sister, Claire, had always been the star of the family. The golden child. Beautiful, confident, charismatic. The kind of woman who could command a room without even trying. And she knew it. She was the one who got the attention, who turned heads, who made people want to be around her. I was the opposite. Not that I was unattractive, but I was different, quieter, more reserved, always in the background of her spotlight. And I had never minded. That was just how things were. She was the leading role, and I was just part of the supporting cast. Then came Jake. He was exactly the type of guy my sister always dated. Handsome, confident to the point of arrogance, the kind of man who never had to try too hard because everything always seemed to fall into place for him. I never paid much attention to him. He wasn't mine to think about, until he was. That night, Claire and Jake had one of their usual blowout fights. The kind where voices rose high enough for the neighbors to hear, where doors slammed, and where Claire would storm off, leaving Jake stewing in his own frustration. I had witnessed their drama enough times to know the cycle: fight, cool off, apologize, pretend it never happened, repeat. So when my phone buzzed at nearly midnight, my first thought was that it was Claire wanting to vent. But when I picked up, it wasn't her. It was Jake. "Hey, can I come over?" His voice was slurred, like he'd had more than a few drinks. I hesitated. This was weird. Claire and Jake had been together for over a year, and in all that time, he had never called me. Not once. "Jake, I don't think that's a good idea." I need to talk to someone, please." Something in his tone made me pause. I wasn't close to Jake, but I wasn't heartless either. And in that moment, he sounded broken. "Fine," I said finally, "but just for a little bit." 15 minutes later, he was at my door. The second I opened it, I regretted it. Jake stood there, leaning against the frame, his eyes slightly glassy, the faint scent of whiskey on his breath. His usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by something else, something vulnerable, something desperate. I should have sent him away. I should have told him to sleep it off and deal with Claire in the morning. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside, letting him in. We sat in my living room, the dim glow of the lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. Jake ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "She doesn't even care, you know," he said bitterly. "Claire, she acts like I don't matter, like I'm just there until she gets bored." I frowned. "You guys always fight, you know how she is." He let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, I do, and yet I keep coming back for more." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I felt something shift in the air between us. Something I didn't like. "You're different from her," he murmured. I stiffened. "Jake, no, listen." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Claire, she's amazing, yeah, but she's also selfish. Everything is always about her. But you actually listen, you care." I swallowed hard. This was dangerous. "Jake, you're drunk, you should get some sleep." He ignored me, his gaze dark and unreadable. "You ever think about it?" I froze. "Think about what?" "What it would be like if things were different, if I had met you first." My stomach twisted. "Jake, stop." But he didn't. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, a light touch, barely anything. And yet, it sent a shock through me. Because it wasn't nothing, I yanked my hand away, standing up abruptly. "You need to go, now," he exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "No, you shouldn't have." He stood slowly, his shoulders tense. For a moment, I thought he might say something else, try to justify what had just happened, but instead, he nodded. "Good night," and then he was gone. I locked the door the second it shut, my heart pounding. I told myself it was over, that nothing had happened, that it was just a drunken mistake. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my skin still tingling where he had touched me, I knew that was a lie, because something had changed. And I had no idea what to do about it. The next morning, I told myself it had never happened. I went about my routine as if Jake hadn't stood in my living room, looking at me like I was someone he had always known but never really seen before, as if he hadn't let words slip from his lips that should have never been spoken. I told myself that when I saw Claire later that day, everything would feel normal again. I was wrong. She showed up at my apartment around noon, sunglasses perched on her head, an oversized coffee cup in hand. "You will not believe the night I had," she groaned, flopping onto my couch like she owned the place. "Jake was being such an ass, again." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the way my stomach clenched at his name. "What happened this time?" She rolled her eyes. Same old, he thinks I don't take him seriously enough, that I'm too independent. Too," she gestured vaguely. "Something, I don't know, he was wasted by the time I left. I crashed at a friend's place." My throat went dry, so she hadn't gone home last night. She hadn't been there when Jake had shown up at my door. "Did he call you?" she asked, taking a sip of her coffee, completely unaware of the landmine she had just dropped in front of me. I hesitated. No. A half-truth, he hadn't called me, he had come to me. For the next few days, I avoided Jake. It wasn't hard. Claire and he were still in their post-fight standoff, neither willing to be the first to make up. I used it as an excuse to bury myself in work, in errands, in anything that kept me out of their orbit. But avoiding someone doesn't erase them. Late at night, my mind replayed that moment, the way he had reached for me, the way his voice had dropped just a little too low. What would it be like if things were different? If I had met you first? I hated that my body had reacted before my brain had, that my skin had burned where he had touched me, that a part of me, a very small and shameful part, had wanted to know the answer. Then, one evening, the universe decided avoidance wasn't an option anymore. I was walking back to my apartment from the store, arms full of grocery bags, when I saw him. He was leaning against his car, parked right in front of my building, arms crossed, his gaze locked on me the second I turned the corner. I froze. Jake pushed off the car and walked toward me, his movements slow, careful. "Hey." I swallowed hard. "Hey," he glanced at my hands. "Need help with those?" I shook my head quickly. "I got it." Silence, heavy, uncomfortable. The kind that made my pulse race for all the wrong reasons. "I wanted to talk," he said finally, "about the other night." I tightened my grip on the bags. "There's nothing to talk about." He exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "Look, I was drunk and upset, but that doesn't mean I didn't mean what I said." My heart pounded. "Jake." "Just tell me," he interrupted, stepping closer. "Tell me you didn't feel anything. Tell me that and I'll walk away." I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I should have told him I felt nothing. I should have met his eyes, forced the lie past my lips, and let it be over. But I stood there in the cooling night air, my fingers tightening around the plastic bags, and I couldn't, because saying it would have made me a liar. The truth, the real truth, was that I had felt something, and I hated myself for it. I hated the way his voice had crawled under my skin, the way my body had betrayed me when he touched my hand that night. But most of all, I hated that right now, standing this close to him again, I felt it all over again. Jake exhaled sharply when I didn't answer. His jaw tensed, and for a second I thought he might just walk away, but instead he shook his head and let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "I knew it," he muttered, mostly to himself. I finally found my voice. "Jake, don't do this. It doesn't mean anything. You were drunk and you were hurting, and I was just trying to be nice." It sounded weak even as I said it. "That's not what this is, and you know it," he shot back. His voice was lower now, rougher, more frustrated. "Don't stand there and pretend like you didn't feel it. Don't pretend like I imagined the way you looked at me." I took a step back. I needed space, distance, air, anything to clear my head. "This is insane. You're with Claire, my sister, and I don't know what the hell you think is going on, but it stops right now." He studied me carefully, like he was trying to pick apart my words, searching for something I wasn't saying. "Fine," he finally said, "if that's what you want." Then he turned and walked away. I didn't watch him go. I couldn't. Instead, I turned on my heel and rushed up to my apartment, closing the door behind me with more force than necessary, pressing my forehead against the wood as I took a shaky breath. "This is over." I repeated it in my head like a mantra, trying to convince myself. "This is over. This is over." But even as I told myself that, I knew I was lying. The next few days passed in a blur. Claire made up with Jake, just like she always did, as if their argument had never happened. They went back to their normal routine, dates, weekend getaways, posting perfectly staged pictures on social media that painted the image of a couple who had everything together. It was a lie. I had always known it was, but now I could see through the cracks. And worse, Jake knew that I could. It was a Friday evening when things fell apart again. I had gone out with some friends, trying to push thoughts of Jake out of my head, trying to remember what normal felt like. When I got back home, my phone buzzed. "Jake, I'm outside." I stared at the screen, my stomach knotting. I should have ignored it. I should have gone to bed. But instead, I found myself walking to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see his car parked outside. My fingers hovered over my phone, my heart hammering as I typed, "Me, why?" It didn't take him long to answer. "Jake, I just need to talk, please." A long pause. "Jake, 5 minutes." I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply before grabbing my keys and stepping outside. He was leaning against his car, his hands in his pockets, watching me carefully as I approached. "I shouldn't be here," I muttered. "Then why are you?" he countered, and I hated that I didn't have an answer. I crossed my arms. "What do you want, Jake?" He let out a slow breath. I need to get this out of my system. And then I'll stop. I swear. But I can't stop thinking about you. And I know it's wrong, I know I should walk away, but the thought of never seeing you again, of pretending like this isn't happening, I don't think I can do it. My throat was dry. "Jake, please." I didn't even know what I was asking for him to stop talking, for him to fix this, for him to say something that would make it all go away. He shook his head, taking a step closer. "Just tell me to go, right now, tell me to leave, and I will." His eyes searched mine, and I knew what he was really asking. I should have told him to leave, but the problem was, I didn't want him to. I should have told him to leave. I should have turned around and gone back inside, closed the door, and locked it behind me. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, staring at Jake, feeling the weight of the silence between us, thick with everything unsaid. He was waiting for my answer, his breath shallow, his hands curling into fists at his sides like he was bracing himself for the rejection he knew was coming. But it didn't come. Because the truth, the awful, undeniable truth, was that I wanted him to stay. And that was my mistake. The moment I didn't send him away, something shifted. He took a step closer, and I didn't move back. His eyes darkened, searching mine for something, some kind of permission, some confirmation that he wasn't the only one feeling this. And I was. My pulse was hammering, my hands trembling, every instinct screaming at me to stop this before it went too far. But it was already too late, because Jake knew. He saw the hesitation in my eyes, the way my breath hitched when his fingers brushed against my wrist. He knew, and he wasn't going to walk away. "I don't want to ruin this for you," he murmured, "but I don't think I can pretend anymore." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Jake, this is wrong." He let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Yeah, I know, but if it's so wrong, why does it feel like the only thing that makes sense?" I had no answer, because I didn't know anymore. He reached out then, his fingertips grazing my cheek, so light it could have been accidental. But it was a test. A slow, deliberate test to see if I would stop him, if I would pull away. And when I didn't, his touch grew firmer, his palm cupping my face, his thumb brushing over my cheekbone. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped him. Instead, I closed my eyes. I felt the warmth of his breath against my lips, and I knew what was coming. Knew, and still, I didn't move. My body betrayed me, leaning into him, drawn by something I didn't want to name. And then, finally, his lips touched mine. It was soft at first, hesitant, like he was giving me one last chance to stop this. One last chance to walk away. But I didn't. Instead, I let out a shaky breath, and that was all it took. The hesitation was gone. His hands slid into my hair, pulling me closer, his lips pressing against mine with a hunger that sent a shiver down my spine. And I kissed him back. God help me, I kissed him back. The world around us ceased to exist. There was no Claire, no consequences, no reality beyond this moment. Just the heat of his mouth on mine, the press of his body against me, the sound of his ragged breath mixing with my own. My fingers found the front of his shirt, gripping it like it was the only thing keeping me standing. And for those few, stolen seconds, nothing else mattered. But then, reality came crashing back. A car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping over us, and the spell was broken. I tore myself away from him, my breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. My heart was racing, my skin burning where he had touched me. Jake looked just as shaken, his lips parted, his chest rising and falling rapidly. My voice failed me. What was I supposed to say? That it was a mistake, that we could pretend this never happened. Jake took a step back, running a hand through his hair. I should go. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. He lingered for a second longer, like he was waiting for me to stop him, but I didn't. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, the night air cool against my heated skin, my thoughts a tangled mess. I knew what had just happened couldn't be undone, that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. And worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to. I woke up the next morning with the taste of regret thick in my mouth. My phone sat on my nightstand, untouched, but I knew if I unlocked it, I'd see messages from Claire. She would want to talk about Jake, about how their fight had finally blown over, about how she always knew they would make up. And I would have to sit there, nodding along, pretending I wasn't thinking about the way her boyfriend's lips had felt on mine the night before. I pulled the blankets over my head, willing the guilt to go away, but it clung to me like a second skin. I had convinced myself for so long that nothing would ever happen, that no matter what Jake said or how he looked at me, I would never let it go too far. And yet, here I was, trapped under the weight of a mistake I couldn't take back. My phone buzzed. I swallowed hard before reaching for it. A message, but not from Claire. Jake, we need to talk. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. A dozen different responses ran through my head, but I typed nothing. What was there to say? We had crossed a line, and now there was no undoing it. I knew I should ignore him. I knew that answering meant letting this become something more than a mistake. But even as I told myself to stay away, my body betrayed me. Me? Not now. Later. I spent the rest of the day avoiding Claire. Every text she sent felt like a slap in the face. Every casual, I love you, sis, a reminder that I didn't deserve her love. By the time I finally saw her, my stomach was in knots. She showed up at my apartment, bright-eyed and glowing, like the fight with Jake had never even happened. I swear he drives me insane, she said, flopping onto my couch. But he always knows how to make it up to me. I forced a smile. Yeah, she sighed, stretching out. We talked last night after he left the bar. I really thought we were done this time, but he said all the right things, you know? Like, I was ready to walk away, but then he looks at me like that, and suddenly I can't be mad anymore. I felt sick after he left the bar. That meant that after he left me, after he kissed me, after he made me feel like I was the only thing on his mind, he had gone straight back to her, said all the right things, and pulled her right back in. I should have felt relieved. I should have been grateful that this meant he and I were nothing more than a mistake. But instead, I felt something else entirely, anger. That night, I met Jake. I told myself it was just to clear the air, just to set boundaries, but the second I saw him, all the words I had rehearsed disappeared. He was leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, looking at me like he knew exactly what was running through my mind. You ignored my texts, he said, his voice unreadable. I had nothing to say. He let out a short laugh. That's a lie. I crossed my arms, trying to keep my composure. It doesn't matter now. You and Claire are fine. Whatever this was, it was a mistake. Jake stepped closer, too close. Then why are you here? I had no answer. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. I should have walked away. The second Jake looked at me like that, like I was the answer to a question he hadn't meant to ask, I should have turned around and left. But I didn't, because the truth, the thing I hadn't let myself admit, was that I didn't want to. He took another step forward, his body close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off of him. Tell me you don't want this, and I swear I'll leave you alone. I opened my mouth, ready to say the words, ready to end this before it became something worse. But my silence stretched between us, betraying me, and I saw the moment he knew. His hand brushed against mine, a whisper of a touch, but it set every nerve in my body on fire. I think about you all the time, he admitted. I know I shouldn't, but I do. And when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake, not for me. My breath caught in my throat. Jake, this is wrong. Then why don't you stop me? I hated him for asking. Hated him for making me face the truth I had been running from, because I could have stopped him. I could have stepped away, but I didn't. Instead, I closed the distance between us. That night, everything changed. We crossed a line we could never uncross, and when I woke up in his bed the next morning, tangled in sheets that weren't mine, I felt both alive and ruined all at once. Jake was still asleep beside me, his face relaxed, his arm draped over my waist as if holding me there. I should have left, slipped out quietly, pretended this never happened. But I stayed. And when he finally opened his eyes and smiled at me, I knew there was no going back. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. I swallowed hard. Morning. For a moment, neither of us moved. The weight of what we had done hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Then, his fingers brushed against my cheek, and the regret I expected to feel never came. "What now?" I whispered, and I wasn't sure if I was asking him or myself. Jake's expression darkened, his fingers tracing slow circles on my skin. "Now, we figure out what happens next." The problem was, I didn't think either of us knew the answer. I spent the next few days floating in some kind of haze. I still saw Claire, still pretended everything was normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time she mentioned Jake, my stomach twisted with guilt, but I couldn't make myself stop. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for his messages, craving the stolen moments we had carved out between the cracks of our lives. It was dangerous, addictive. Then, one evening, Claire invited me over for dinner. I hesitated, making up an excuse, but she brushed it off. "Jake will be there," she added, like that would be the thing to convince me, and she was right. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting next to her, smiling at her in that way that made my stomach knot. But then his eyes met mine across the room, and for a split second, it was like we were the only two people there. Claire laughed at something he said, leaning into him, her fingers brushing against his arm, and a sharp pang of something I didn't want to name shot through me. I had known this was a mistake. I had known it the second it started. But now, I was completely drowning in it. Sitting across from Claire and Jake at dinner was the hardest thing I had ever done. I should have said no, should have found an excuse to leave before I even sat down. But instead, I was here, watching them play the perfect couple while my heart pounded in my chest. Every laugh Claire let out, every touch she gave him felt like a silent scream inside my head, a reminder that I had shattered something I could never put back together. Jake barely looked at me, but I could feel him. Every move he made, every shift in his chair sent sparks up my spine. And then, in the middle of dinner, his foot brushed against mine under the table. A simple, fleeting touch, but enough to make my breath hitch. He didn't move away, and neither did I. "You okay?" Claire asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at me. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and went back to talking about her day. But Jake knew better. He always did. His foot pressed more firmly against mine before finally retreating, and the loss of contact sent a wave of frustration through me that I had no right to feel. After dinner, Claire went into the kitchen to grab drinks, leaving me alone with Jake for the first time that night. The silence between us was thick, heavy with things we couldn't say. He leaned in slightly, his voice just low enough that only I could hear. "Meet me later." I turned my head sharply toward him. "Jake." "Please." The way he said it, the way his voice dipped into something raw, something almost desperate, sent a shiver down my spine. I should have said no. I should have walked out the door and never looked back. But instead, I found myself nodding. I told Claire I had an early morning and left soon after. My hands were shaking as I drove, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't untangle. I should have been thinking about the consequences, about what this would do to my sister, to me, to everything. But the only thing I could think about was him. When I got to the place we always met, he was already there, leaning against his car, arms crossed, watching me as I pulled in. The second I stepped out, he was on me, his hands cupping my face, his lips crashing into mine. It was reckless, dangerous, but I didn't care. I kissed him back like I needed him to breathe, like he was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered against his lips, but my fingers were already tangling in his hair, my body betraying me. "Then stop me," he murmured, his hands sliding down my back, pulling me closer. I didn't stop him. I couldn't, because I was already too far gone. The second his lips touched mine, the last shred of resistance I had crumbled. There was no more pretending, no more justifying, no more lying to myself that this was just a mistake that could be erased. The truth was, I wanted him just as much as he wanted me, and there was no going back now. His hands roamed my body, desperate and needy, as if he had been starving for this, and maybe he had. Maybe we both had. The heat between us was undeniable, a pull so strong that no amount of logic could break it. I was lost in him, in the way he kissed me like he was afraid I would disappear, in the way his fingers dug into my hips, anchoring me to the moment. "Tell me this isn't just in my head," Jake murmured against my lips, his breath heavy, his eyes dark with something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Tell me you want this too." I couldn't lie, not anymore. I do. That was all it took. He backed me against the car, his body pressing into mine, his mouth finding my neck, his hands exploring every inch of me like he was memorizing the way I felt. The world outside of this moment didn't exist. No Claire, no guilt, no consequences, just us. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. That the weight of this night would settle over me like a shadow, one that would never fade. But right now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was him. I don't know how long we stayed like that, wrapped up in each other, lost in the fever of something we should have never allowed to happen. But eventually, reality crept back in. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the name flashing on the screen making my stomach twist. Claire. Panic gripped me as I shoved Jake away, my breath coming in sharp gasps. He looked just as shaken, his chest rising and falling, his fingers still gripping my arms. "I have to go," I whispered, stepping back. He reached for me, his expression unreadable. "Olivia, wait." But I was already turning away, fumbling for my keys, my mind spinning with what I had just done. What we had just done. I couldn't face Claire. Not now, not like this. I needed time. Space. A way to undo something that could never be undone. I got into my car and drove, my heart pounding, my thoughts screaming at me that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. But the worst part? I wasn't sure if I regretted it. I barely remember the drive home. My fingers clenched the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The weight of what I had just done settled over me like a crushing force, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My phone was still buzzing in the passenger seat, Claire again. I couldn't bring myself to answer. Not yet. Not with the taste of Jake still lingering on my lips, the heat of his hands still burning on my skin. My entire body felt like it was betraying me, holding on to the memory of something I should have never allowed to happen. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at my front door, knowing that the second I stepped inside, I would have to face reality. I would have to live with this choice. I had crossed the line, and there was no erasing it. Claire's name flashed on my phone again, and this time I forced myself to pick up. "Hey," I said, my voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Where the hell have you been?" Claire's voice was laced with irritation, but beneath it, I could hear concern. "I've been calling you for over an hour." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. I was out, just needed some air. "Well, Jake said he tried calling you too. He was worried." My entire body tensed. Worried. That was the word she used. Like Jake was some innocent boyfriend checking on his girlfriend's little sister, and not the man who had just kissed me like he wanted to consume every inch of me. "Yeah, I saw," I lied. "My phone was on silent. I'll text him back later." "Good. Anyway, are you free tomorrow? Let's grab lunch. I miss you." The guilt hit me so hard I almost doubled over. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. "Yeah, sure." "Great, love you, sis." "Love you too," I whispered before the call ended. I sat there in silence, the weight of my betrayal suffocating me. And then my phone vibrated again. A new message, not from Claire. "Jake, we need to talk." I exhaled sharply, staring at the screen, feeling the pull of something I knew I should resist but wouldn't. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Jake's hands on me, the press of his body, the heat of his breath against my skin, but worse than that was the guilt. It dug into me like claws, whispering that I had destroyed something I could never repair. I had betrayed Claire in the worst possible way, and yet I still craved him. By morning, I was exhausted, drained from the war waging inside me. But I had no time to sit in my misery because I had agreed to meet Claire for lunch. And if I canceled now, she'd start asking questions I couldn't answer. I walked into the cafe and spotted her instantly, waving at me with a bright smile. She has no idea. That thought made my stomach turn. I forced a smile and sat down across from her. "You look tired," she said, stirring her iced coffee. "Long night?" "Yeah, just had trouble sleeping," I muttered, keeping my eyes on my menu, afraid that if I looked at her for too long, she'd see the truth written all over my face. "You and me both," she sighed. "Jake was acting weird last night." I mean, he's always a little moody, but something felt off. I nearly dropped my fork. Did he say something? Did she suspect? My pulse quickened and I forced myself to remain calm. "What do you mean?" Claire shrugged. "I don't know, he seemed distracted, kept checking his phone like he was waiting for something, and when I asked him about it, he brushed me off." I swallowed hard. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe. She took a sip of her drink, studying me closely. "Hey, has he texted you lately? I know you two don't talk much, but I figured maybe he needed someone to vent to after our fight." For a second, I thought my heart had stopped. "Lie, say something, say anything." "No," I said too quickly, shaking my head. "I haven't heard from him." Claire narrowed her eyes slightly, as if trying to read between the lines. "Huh, okay, weird." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay steady. "You guys okay now?" "Yeah, I guess. He apologized, said he was just stressed, but I don't know, I still feel like something's off with him." Because he kissed me, because I let him. Because now there's a lie sitting between us that will never go away. I forced a smile. "I'm sure it's nothing." But I knew that was a lie too. I barely made it through lunch without breaking. Every time Claire smiled at me, every time she laughed, every time she mentioned Jake, it felt like a knife twisting deeper into my gut. The weight of what I had done was suffocating, pressing down on me with every breath. I forced myself to act normal, to nod at the right moments, to laugh when I was supposed to, but the whole time, my mind was elsewhere, on him, on us, on the lie that had already grown too big to contain. Claire kept talking about their weekend plans, about how Jake had been distant, but she figured he was just stressed, about how relationships took work. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her everything and let her hate me because at least then I wouldn't have to carry this secret alone. But I couldn't. I wasn't that brave. The moment I got home, I collapsed onto my couch, my phone already in my hand before I even thought about it. "Jake, are you okay?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Was I? No, but what was I supposed to say? Me? "We can't keep doing this." The message was delivered, seen, and then nothing. The silence stretched, suffocating me more than the lie itself. Minutes passed, then my phone vibrated. "Jake, can we talk in person?" I stared at the screen, my heart hammering. I should have said no. I should have put an end to this once and for all, but I didn't. Me? Tonight, my place. By the time Jake arrived, the sun had already set, casting long shadows across my apartment. He stood in the doorway, eyes unreadable, tension radiating off of him. "This is getting out of control," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He exhaled, stepping inside, closing the door behind him. "I know." We stood there, neither of us knowing what to say next. "Do you regret it?" His voice was cautious, as if he was afraid of my answer. I swallowed hard. "I don't know." That was the truth. I hated what we had done, but I didn't hate him. "I think about you all the time," Jake admitted, stepping closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Even when I shouldn't." My breath hitched, but I forced myself to hold my ground. "Claire, I know," he cut me off. "I know what this means, but I can't stop." He was too close now, his scent wrapping around me, pulling me back into the chaos of this mess we had created. "Then we're both screwed," I murmured, and before I could stop myself, I reached for him. Jake's hands were on me instantly, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was all desperation and fire. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just pure, reckless need. We shouldn't have done it. We knew that, but knowing didn't stop us. It never had. And this time, there would be no going back. The moment Jake left, I collapsed onto my bed, my body still burning from his touch, my mind a tangled mess of guilt and desire. This wasn't supposed to happen again. I had meant it when I told him we needed to stop, but the second he was near me, the second he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, every ounce of resolve I had shattered. And now, I was deeper than ever, drowning in something I couldn't escape. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed everything. His hands, his mouth, the way he whispered my name like a secret only he was allowed to keep. But beneath all of that was the growing fear that we were running out of time. Something was going to break. The next morning, Claire called. I hesitated before answering, my stomach twisting. "Hey, you busy today?" Her voice was light, casual, completely unaware of the weight crushing my chest. "Not really," I lied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Good, let's do something. I feel like we haven't really hung out lately." My breath caught. "Because I've been with your boyfriend. Because I've been lying to you every single day." "Sure, yeah, what do you want to do?" "Let's go shopping. Maybe grab some drinks after." I need a distraction. Jake been acting weird again. My blood ran cold. Weird how? I don't know, just distant. Like even when we're together, it's like he's somewhere else. It's probably just work stress, but you know me, I always overthink things. He's distant because he's with me. The thought made me sick. "I'm sure it's nothing," I managed, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. "I'll meet you in an hour." Shopping with Claire was an exercise in self-control. Every time she mentioned Jake, I felt like I was about to snap, like the lie between us was growing so big it was suffocating me. And the worst part, I could feel her watching me like she sensed something was off. "You okay?" she asked as we sifted through racks of clothes. "Yeah, just tired," I said quickly. "You sure?" She studied me for a moment. "You seem kind of, I don't know, off." My heart pounded. She knows. "I'm fine," I forced a laugh. "Promise?" She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. For now. That night, I stayed locked in my apartment, ignoring my phone, ignoring Jake's messages, ignoring the fact that every second that passed was another step closer to everything falling apart. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't be able to run from this forever. The walls were closing in, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. I knew it was only a matter of time before Claire started piecing things together. The weight of what Jake and I had done wasn't just something I carried, it was shifting the space between us, altering the way I reacted to her, the way he looked at me when she wasn't paying attention. And Claire wasn't stupid. She noticed everything. It started small. Subtle moments, fleeting glances, questions that felt just a little too pointed. "You've been weird lately," she said one afternoon when we met for coffee. "I don't know, distant? You're not hiding something from me, are you?" I forced a laugh, stirring my drink too aggressively. What would I even be hiding? The way she looked at me sent a chill through my spine. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Jake wasn't handling it much better. The messages he sent were riskier, his presence more reckless. "I need to see you," he texted one night, and I almost threw my phone across the room. "We're being stupid. We need to stop." But I didn't say that. I didn't say anything at all. Ignoring him didn't make the pull disappear, though. It just made it worse. He showed up at my door the next day, unannounced, and the second I saw him standing there, I knew we had crossed into dangerous territory. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, glancing over my shoulder, paranoid that Claire would somehow just know. "I needed to see you," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "This isn't smart, Jake. Nothing about this is smart." He closed the space between us, and for a moment it was like nothing else existed. Just the heat between us, the way his breath hitched when I didn't pull away. "We have to stop," I whispered, even as I let him touch me. Even as I let my fingers curl into his shirt, even as I leaned in. We didn't stop, we never did. Weekend, Claire called me while I was at home, pacing, unable to shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. "Hey, can I ask you something?" Her voice was calm, but there was something else there, something guarded. "Of course," I said, my grip on my phone tightening. "Has Jake been acting different around you?" My stomach plummeted. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she admitted. "It's like, sometimes when you're around, he looks at you like..." She cut herself off, laughing awkwardly. "Never mind, I'm probably being paranoid. I had a weird feeling the other day. Maybe I'm just overthinking." I should have reassured her, should have laughed it off, changed the subject, convinced her that she had nothing to worry about. But all I could do was sit there in silence, gripping my phone like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "You're probably overthinking," I finally forced out, my voice too thin, too strained. "Yeah, probably," she agreed, but I knew she wasn't convinced. Something had shifted. She was starting to see the cracks, and I had no idea how much longer we had before everything came crashing down. It was over. I could feel it before it even happened, like a storm brewing on the horizon, something inevitable and impossible to stop. Claire wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was looking at me differently, her words sharper, her silences longer. And Jake, he was unraveling, his careful facade cracking under the weight of the lies we had built between us. We weren't being careful anymore. We were reckless, desperate. And now it was all about to collapse. The night it finally happened, I was at home, my phone sitting heavy in my palm. "Jake," We need to talk. Me, not now, Jake. Claire knows something, I can feel it. My stomach twisted as I stared at the message. He was right. She was getting too close. She had been watching him, watching me. The way she hesitated before speaking, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't want to believe was real. But it was real. And the moment she found the missing piece, it would all be over. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was Jake. It was Claire. My blood ran cold. Claire, are you home? I need to talk to you. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. I typed out a response, my fingers trembling. Me? Yeah, come over. My heart pounded as I waited, pacing, every breath shallow and uneven. I already knew what she was going to say. What I didn't know was how I was going to answer. When she arrived, I could see it immediately. She already knew. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were burning. She stepped inside, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, she took a slow breath. Are you going to lie to me? The question hit me like a slap. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. Claire, just tell me the truth. Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. Is there something going on between you and Jake? I could have denied it. I could have kept the lie going a little longer. But there was no point. The truth was already there, sitting between us, suffocating both of us. My lips parted, and for the first time, I let the truth out. Yes! The word was barely more than a whisper, but it shattered everything. Claire's breath hitched, her eyes widening for a split second before she forced herself to steady. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking her head. Wow, I really hoped I was wrong. I wanted to say anything, but what was there to say? There was no apology that could fix this, no explanation that would make it okay. How long? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. Claire, how long? I closed my eyes, shame burning through me. A while. Silence, heavy, unbearable silence. Then, suddenly, she laughed again, but it was broken, hollow. And here I was thinking you were the one person I could trust. My chest ached, but I didn't deserve to hurt. That pain belonged to her. Claire, I never meant... Don't, she snapped, her voice sharp. Don't you dare tell me you didn't mean it. You don't accidentally sleep with someone's boyfriend. You don't just fall into this. You made a choice. You made so many choices. Her hands trembled at her sides, and for a second I thought she might hit me. Part of me wished she would. I deserved it. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she stopped, her back still to me. You just lost me. I hope he was worth it. And then she was gone. I stood there, staring at the door, the weight of her words crashing over me like a wave I couldn't outrun. She was right. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it. The silence after Claire left was deafening. I stood there, staring at the door, half expecting her to come back, to scream at me, to demand more answers, but she didn't. She was gone, and she wasn't coming back. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I had lost her, my sister, my best friend, and there was no way to fix it. I barely noticed when my phone buzzed. When I finally looked at the screen, it was Jake. Jake, did she find out? The sheer audacity of the question made my stomach turn. I wanted to throw my phone against the wall, to scream at him, to tell him this was his fault just as much as it was mine. But the truth was, I had made my choices too. I let this happen. Me, she knows, it's over. I stared at the screen, waiting for a response, but nothing came. And for the first time, it hit me, Jake had gotten what he wanted. He had pushed me to the edge, convinced me to cross a line, and now, when it all fell apart, he had nothing to lose. Claire wasn't his sister. I was the one left with the wreckage. Hours passed, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The weight of everything crashed down on me all at once. I thought back to the moment it all started, to the night Jake first showed up at my door, and I wondered if this had always been inevitable. If I had always been doomed to destroy the one person who had loved me unconditionally. The next morning, Claire's absence felt like a ghost in my apartment. I picked up my phone more times than I could count, hovering over her name, wanting to send something, an apology, an explanation, something to make this hurt less. But nothing I could say would change what I had done. Jake texted me again later that day. Jake, are you okay? I stared at the message, my fingers twitching over the keyboard. I could go to him. I could let him tell me that none of this was my fault, that Claire would come around, that this would all blow over. But that was another lie, and I was so tired of lying. Me, don't text me again. I hit send before I could change my mind. And then, for the first time since this all began, I turned my phone off. I didn't know what was next. I didn't know if Claire would ever speak to me again. But I knew one thing for certain. This was over. Finally, truly over. The end. Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.